My new book is now available for purchase at your preferred online bookseller. We Chose Play, Raising an Autistic Child to Thrive and Feel Understood. Learn more at affectautism.com/wechoseplay, all one word. Affect Autism, in its 10th year of providing free, supportive content for your DIR journey.
All of Affect Autism's podcasts are produced and edited by Daria Brown. Please note that the views expressed during all episodes are solely those of the individuals involved, do not constitute educational or medical advice, and do not necessarily reflect the views of Affect Autism, Daria Brown, nor ICDL and associated parties. Listeners should consult with professionals familiar with their individual circumstances for specific support.
You're listening to DIR Dialogues, a podcast from Affect Autism, where a panel of practitioners discuss topics related to the developmental, individual differences, relationship-based, or DIR model and its practice.
Hello, Floortimers. I am so excited for this other edition of DIR Dialogues on Gestalt language processors. This is such a buzz topic, and it's been so prevalent on social media with parents. I had a podcast before with speech language pathologist Sabrina O'Keefe about the topic, and I wanted to dive in further. So what better way to do that than with 5 DIRFloortime expert training leaders who are all speech language pathologists. So we are going to explore Gestalt language processing through a DIR lens, developmental individual differences relationship-based model. And we're going to maybe refer back to that past podcast. So if you haven't heard it, I will put a link to it in the show notes. Let's start introducing everybody. Katie Shepard is with the International Council on Development and Learning and a private practice in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, with special interest in alternative and augmentative communication, AAC, apraxia of speech, motor planning, and language development. Welcome, Katie.
Thank you.
Brooks Barrick, returning guest, has an official accredited DIR organization just outside of Kansas City, Kansas, with occupational therapist Emily Tritz, called Kansas City Developmental Therapies, where they offer DIR services. She originally trained in floor time at The Bunker with Drs. Greenspan and Weeder in Washington, D.C., and in the Play Project with Dr. Rick Solomon when it was back at his home in Michigan. Welcome back, Brooks.
Hi, thank you. Excited about this topic.
Erin Forward is joining us from Charleston, South Carolina, where she is at a small private practice. She has advanced training in pediatric feeding and swallowing disorders, early language, AAC, and trauma specifically for medically complex children. She's also a certified lactation counselor, a trust-based relational intervention, or TBRI, trained practitioner, and a regular co-host of the First Bite podcast with fellow SLP, Michelle L.W. Dawson. Welcome back, Erin.
Thank you.
And Dr. Jolene Fernald joins us from just outside of Tampa, Florida, where she specializes in selective mutism and alternative and augmentative communication intervention, and is the selective mutism clinical coordinator at accredited DIR organization Jolene R. Fernald Pediatric Therapy Services. She's also an adjunct professor at Granite State College and the co-founder of Reconnections Education Center. And I'll link back to the podcast we did with Jolene before if you want to learn more about that, her school. She's also the creator of a new DIR selective mutism card deck published by Bjoram Speech, which we will link to. Welcome back, Jolene.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
And first-time guest, Jessica Schmidt, is a clinical director for a pediatric practice offering occupational, physical, and speech therapy using a DIR floor time approach. Her professional areas of experience include AAC, Gestalt language processors, early communicators, and medically complex bodies, and she is joining us from Virginia. Welcome to the podcast, Jessica.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's nice to have you on after meeting you, I think, in 2020.
I think so. I think
in New York conference.
Yeah, I was at the New York conference. Yep.
Right before COVID.
Right before.
I'm so excited that all of you were able to make time and we were able to find a time that we could all meet. The buzzword Gestalt language processors. So this is where a child will use a script from an emotional, meaningful experience, can be from movies or videos they've seen. And I had a podcast years ago with SLP Jahan Abu Bakr Shahata, and she talked about scripting being meaningful communication, and we did not mention GLP at all. So that shows you how recent it is that this term is being used all the time. So, Jolene, can you define for us what is Gestalt language processing?
Sure. I think you did a beautiful job describing, I think, the definition that most people are using now. I was in graduate school back in the 90s, and the terms that we mostly used back then were delayed or immediate echolalia. So when we talked about, if it was delayed, then it wasn't that, hearing it and then repeating back, but there was some time in between. And so now I think that for my brain, having been in this field for about 30 years, my brain says, okay, this is delayed echolalia. And back in the 90s, Barry Prezant, which I think many of your listeners probably are familiar with his work, but Barry and Patty Prelock, who was a professor at the University of Vermont, they started doing some research back then on the concept of echolalia and this sort of imitation scripting concept. And really, they started talking about it from the perspective of it being meaningful, which I think, again, the GLP camp uses that, the community uses that term, right? That it has meaning behind it. But they were also talking about the purpose of echolalia at the time, and it seemed to be related to, again, some meaningful emotional experience that was being brought up in that delayed imitation, or it was a way for kids to process information, so that incoming, language processing at the time, it sort of bought them a window of time to then be able to express themselves, so that it was sort of this opportunity to reprocess in their mind before they responded, or it was used as sort of just a time shift, in between, so that they would fill that gap, fill that space when they didn't quite know what language to use or what to actually answer during that time. So maybe if they didn't quite process or didn't quite understand. So those three reasons seem to be back in the 90s what the concept that now has turned into the GLP term, I think, that is much more, it is very new, it's very recent, and it's definitely gaining speed in the field as far as awareness goes.
So part of why I wanted to do this DIR dialogues is because in DIR, we have this unique position where we talk about individual differences, and in speech and language, that's about individual ways that children process information and learn to communicate. And I think in the podcast with Sabrina, we touched on how, scripting is part of everybody's communication. I mean, if something happens that reminds me of an event of my childhood, me, my mom, my brother, like if I just say something like, you are a pirate, they know what I mean. And it's from this video we took when I was a little, dressed as whatever, Holly Hobby or something back in the 70s. And my brother was a pirate. And we got a video camera for the first time in 1979. And my dad was filming our things. And I said, for Halloween, I'm Holly Hobby. And my brother said, and I'm going to be a pirate. And I turned to him and I said, you are a pirate. And then continued like talking. And so that script is something that comes up all the time when something obvious is said. And I say, you are a pirate. And, it's just this thing that we know. So my son, I would say, to me, seemed more like an analytical language processor. The way he learned language was very typical, but he does use a lot of scripts, and he does remember things that are more reminiscent of emotional experiences we've had together. So if I mix up something and make a snafu, because I say, Nabbit instead of Fuzzy or whatever Mario character, he says, ha ha ha, Mama said Hudson instead of Pacific, which is when I looked at a model train and I said it was a Pacific, but it was actually a Hudson, which is like the wheel configuration of the trains was a 424 instead of a 464 instead of a 462 or whatever. So those kinds of scriptings, I think we're all familiar with. Like we will sing song lyrics because it brings back an emotional experience. But some kids that I know literally only use scripts. And Sabrina described some of those scripts, and Jahan described some of those scripts in the past two podcasts that I did on this topic. So let me go to Aaron, because I know you brought up some information and some interesting points in our email exchanges beforehand. What does GLP mean to you when you think of it in a DIR context? Or maybe how do you experience GLP clients?
Get something that, with this being a newer topic and there being so much advocacy, which is so important, the language we use is valuable and does have a lot of meaning, but the tricky part then becomes putting too many labels sometimes. And I think with the DIR framework and perspective, like, I'm keeping Gestalt language processing in mind always, but not before the individual child that's in front of me. And so I think that's a really important piece, is to not overgeneralize what information there is out there about GLP before you really get to understand that child's individual differences. Because there are, yes, I believe that these scripts are meaningful and that they come from these experiences, but sometimes it's not always communication, it's information, if that makes sense. So I have a boy I worked with, and when we first started seeing him, he would say, "What's that? What's that? What's that? What's that?" with everything in the room. And that was his connection seeking. That was how he knew how to connect with someone. And we grew so much in his language and communication. But when he would get dysregulated, I would hear, "What's that? What's that? What's that?" And it was him saying, "I need connection. I need engagement. I need regulation." That's meaning, but it's different meaning than maybe what people would expect from it. And so when I see a lot of this information that's out there, I think it's so wonderful. And I think with anything that's newer, you're going to have to go a little extreme to get people's attention to find the happy middle. And I think that's what we're seeing happening too, is like, let's get so much information. People need to hear this. People need to know. But now let's find this balance of like what this means in the context of everything else that we know. And so that's what I always try to say to families too, is like, you're learning about this. That's amazing. This is so much information, but let's look at your child first and who they are, because that's the most important piece. This is a piece of the puzzle. And we don't love all these labels too. Like, when I have a lot of students and they'll always ask me in notes, like, how do I write this? I'm like, write what you're seeing. And that is the most important piece. And then, we can take from there, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So Brooks, I know that, it seems to me that when I hear a lot of parents now, I facilitate ICDL's parent support meetings, they'll say, "My child's a GLP, blah, 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 blah." So they start with that. Whereas I think in DIR, we want to start with other things.
Yeah, I mean, I think most of us, sounds like Julie, and I haven't been working quite as long as you, but a couple decades. So been around a long time. And so none of this is new information, right? Like what Barry Prezant was doing, what Marge Blanc's research, like none of this is new. But there are really good social media influencers who are talking about it. And so it is being brought up a lot by families. And so I think our job becomes listening and validating what families are hearing, because that's part of our job as floor timers, but also doing what Aaron was saying and making sure we're putting the individual first, right? So yes, that's great information. Tell me more about why you think your child is a GLP. But then what are we going to do with that information, right? And I think the thing that I get cautious about is anytime somebody wants to use a protocol in a very protocol driven way. So I think there's so much good information, and I think we can use all these different tools from our toolbox. But if we make the child fit the protocol instead of the protocol working for us as a tool, that's when we take out the joy. We take out the engagement, we take out the reciprocity, all of the stuff that we're looking for. And so I think getting back to the individual differences, getting back to being curious about like, I wonder why that chunk of language, or like my mentor, Sherry Kahn, always talks about his borrowed language. Why did that chunk of language, why do you think that feels meaningful? And let's get curious about it. Because I find in my practice, I'll see kids who are older and they might still be using borrowed language. They might be using so much novel language and so much back and forth. But if we get to a place where they are not in felt safety or emotions are high, then I'll see, like I had one kid who said, "Did Pete cry? Goodness, no." And I had never heard him use like any sort of gestalt or borrowed language. But I think in that moment, what he was trying to say to me was like, "Don't whine. I know you keep saying the session is over. Don't whine. Just get over it. And we're going to keep playing." Right. Like I had to get curious about what that meant. So I think that's our job, is to hold and support the families and listen deeply to what they're saying, but then help make sure that I is guiding us.
So, Katie, do you have to go and watch every child movie and know every child character? I'm joking, because obviously the parents will tell us the information. Oh, that is a script from this show or whatever. But I know you talk a lot about, Katie, about affect. You presented on affect at the ICDL conference last year. Where does the GLP fit in with the whole piece of affect in the DIR model?
Well, the first question that you asked, do you have to go and watch every child's favorite movie or their favorite cartoons where they may be using scripts from? And the answer is no, but is it important for us to be an investigator of their intent? Absolutely. And would it be great to watch a lot of the things that they're highly motivated by? Absolutely, so that we can understand that intent. And so that is something about NLA and about Gestalt language processing that I think is wonderful. They are really thinking about what is the meaning behind this script. And as DIR floor time providers, that's what we care about most, is making meaning. And we care about the individual's intent. And how do we do that? Through affect. What you're talking about. We use our affect to make every single word that we say, but not only word, every single gesture that we use meaningful. So that's where affect comes in, is adding to the meaning and making sure that we are always having meaningful experiences and sharing meaningful experiences, whether it be a conversation without words that we need to celebrate. And I worry about that sometimes when I am listening to some of the students that are in my classes right now that are trained in Gestalt language processing. I think so many of the things that they do are absolutely fantastic, but I sometimes get a little bit concerned about their awareness and and how much they value the pre-linguistics. So that's another topic that we could bring up.
Yes, I'll refer back. I'll link to the podcast with Mary Beth Stark on the pre-linguistic stuff that we talked about in the affect, and I sent you guys all a link that you may or may not have had time to go to, because his podcasts are so long. Andrew Huberman's podcast, which he's fantastic. But I managed to like listen just this morning to the interview with Dr. Alan Shore, and oh my goodness, we have to get him at an ICDL conference. That was just incredible. I know I've heard his name here and there before, but what stood out to me that I didn't really register in the past things that I've heard about him is the whole piece of the affect being right-brained, and that in order to regulate and have emotional regulation, it's all right brain. And that does not come through cognitive stuff and language. And so I think that's what you're getting at, Katie, is like that meaningful emotional connection with somebody, which is all totally right-brained and implicit, not explicit, as Dr. Shore talks about in the interview with Andrew Huberman, which I will put the link to it. Jessica, how do you see this working with your clients who maybe the only language they have is Gestalts, and or they're using AAC devices? I guess maybe we can get into, because parents maybe are saying, how do I get my child to speak, right? And of course, some may never have spoken language, and parents often hold on to that, especially early on. But how are you DIR SLPs facilitating communication development?
It's a really good question. So I was gonna to kind of go back to what Jolene had said early on. I was in graduate school. I graduated in 2017, and so even in graduate school this term, GLP, Gestalt Language Processing, was not really talked about even then. I would say this has been the last 5 years, and it's such an important conversation to be having. But the way that we have that overarching conversation, but then the way that we apply it, boots on the ground to our kids in the clinic on a day-to-day basis, is really different. And like Katie said too, it's a tool in our toolbox to use some of these strategies. But with my current patients, I'm more leaning on my DIR training, I would say, than my Gestalt language processing training, because it's about, at the very basic level, is like following their lead, creating that emotional connection, and seeing what happens when you respond to that. So, for example, I had a relatively new kiddo on my caseload several weeks ago. He was getting really frustrated. He wasn't able to find the keyboard on his AAC device. So his AAC device is laid out in single word with some like partial gestalts, but mostly single words. His passion in life is the ABCs. And so he was getting really, really upset. He couldn't find the ABC page, and he started saying, want to cry, want to cry. And I, in that moment, was able to, figure out that, like, oh, you're looking for the ABC page, because then he kind of started singing like for A, B for B. And so I was like, oh, let's go to that keyboard page. And then as soon as I went to that keyboard page, he was totally all smiles. And so with a kiddo like that, using my DIR training to follow that emotional lead. So this is what he was using that Gestalt for. And was it in the moment directed at me? Maybe, maybe not. But now it is. Now in the future, it's going to be directed at me because I used my following his natural lead, kind of getting him into a joint engagement with me, getting that reciprocity, using my affect to draw him in. But I would say it's more of you're relying on your DIR versus this protocol of I'm going to do stage 1. Now we're working on stage 2. Now we're working on stage 3. You're more reliant on your DIR training versus this very, like, in a way, structured protocol.
Building off of that too, I think there's knowing more about this and having this language. What I oftentimes see too is like there's such a strong desire with this protocol, like, okay, when are we going to get to stage 2? When are we going to get to stage 3? When are we going to get to stage 4? But I think what a lot of us have already said today is this, we have this information and now it helps us understand that child better. And because I see a lot of like model more and more language, give them more scripts, give them so much more language. But if we don't pull into the DIR piece of like all those other individual differences in building connection and building relationship, that can be too overwhelming. We have to know who that child is. And I oftentimes encourage caregivers to like, let's live in, you have this information. Now you're learning more about how to connect with them. Now we're having these like, this back and forth engagement because I finally understand what this means. And like, that's beautiful in and of itself, even with this, them continuing to use these like stage 1 gestalts, because you're building resilience in your relationship so that we can build off of that. And so, like Katie said, like thinking about those pre-linguistic sharing meaning, you have this key, this beautiful understanding now of like, let's play detective of what this means so we can share an understanding together and build off of that even more than the like modeling more and more language to see what they they kind of cling to, I guess.
Yeah, Jessica.
Thanks, Erin, for pointing that out. I also think too that part of the information sharing with parents as well, and part of where so much of this, where we have to kind of like mitigate the information too, is letting parents know that we are all a mix of analytical and Gestalt language processors. There is no like 0, 100, 100, 0. We're all a mixture. And so much like our neurodiversity, it's a spectrum. And it can be like you're maybe 10% analytical, 90% Gestalt. We all, even our typical language learners, have Gestalt, ready, set, go, 3, 2, 1, blast off. What Sabrina said in the previous podcast, like, hi, how are you? And so we have to remember too that we're all a mixture of both. And so at some point, like we are using both a Gestalt language processing in one moment, but then maybe an analytical in another moment. And that's okay. It's okay because at that point, we're looking at the child's individual differences, like what part of their language is Gestalt, what part of their language is analytical, and tailoring our relationship and tailoring our interaction to that rather than looking at it as like 12 eggs in one basket, 0 in the other.
Yeah, and I mean, I just wanted to add this because I've been listening a lot to the Autistic Culture podcast. I'll put a link to it in the notes. And, you know, I picture them saying, like, hi, how are you? Are all these, like, from an autistic culture perspective, meaningless gestalts that neurotypicals use versus the gestalts that autistics use, which are filled with meaning and filled with this emotion and this connection and this right brain autobiographical memories that Alan Shore talked about. Brooks, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I think also if we were to talk to Marge Blanc, I don't know her. I've been lucky enough to meet Barry Prezant, and I think Barry's research points out what Jessica was just saying and affirms that. Like, I don't think that Barry Prezant and Amy Weatherby and some of these other people who were doing all of this research in the beginning in the 70s and 80s even ever thought that we would start categorizing you're here or you're here, right? Like, I think they were talking about that. What we might be seeing is sometimes families are only seeing these pretty snapshots on social media, right? And so then it becomes this oversimplification. But even from the beginning, if you read Marge's work and you read Barry's work, like what is awesome about this movement and this trend to talk about it is they are developmental language therapists. They're thinking in a developmental way. And so I think that's wonderful. And I think we're also listening more to autistic lived experiences. And that's why we're hearing about this more. So all of that is so exciting. I think all of us as DIR practitioners are like, this is great. We're so happy that people are talking about it. But what do we do with it? Because going back to Katie, I think all of us from a developmental lens are always thinking about meaning making and comprehension. Like, I just deeply want to know about comprehension. Like, what is a child understanding? And then how can I help build on that understanding? Because we also know that understanding supports regulation. So it's all, I mean, it's, and so when you try to simplify into these smaller things, it's such a complex thing, because also language is a cognitive task. And that's also cool about this movement, is because this recognizes language as a cognitive task versus language as a behavior to be reinforced.
Yeah, Katie, you wanted to jump in there.
Just really quickly, I just wanted to thank you for saying what you said, Brooks, and just build on it just a little bit about our appreciation for development and how much we think about development in DIR. And I always think about Jolene and when she did one of her presentations, that she really pointed out content, form, and use. And when we think about 201 as DIR experts, and we're thinking about building our DIR providers' understanding of communication and language and what is language. There's content, form, and use. And we talk about how oftentimes traditional speech language pathologists have put a little bit too much focus on the form, and we really bring out the importance of the use and of the meaning and the content. But we can't forget the importance of form because that is development as well. And so I think that is something that is valuable about understanding Gestalt language processing and understanding the things that Marge Blanc she brings to the table, and she talks about all the people that have influenced her, like Laura Lee, Ann Peters, Barry Prezant, all of these wonderful people that have been developmental clinicians or developmental specialists. And so I just wanted to build on that I do want to understand grammar and its development, and that is also a process. And in DIR floor time, we're always thinking about the process. So I want to appreciate that individual difference, but I don't want to forget all of the other ones. And I want to make sure that we're thinking of this in an integrated way.
I want to get more on that and go to Jolene, but first, Jessica, you wanted to add something.
Wanted to say something really fast. Like, I think Katie and Brooks just hit the nail on the head. Language is not only a cognitive task, but it's a complex cognitive task. And so when we see these form, content, use, there are so many like subcategories under each of those different little bubbles that it's such a complex process. But yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
And Jessica, as a new mother, do you have emerging language yet? That must be super exciting.
It's super exciting. We have some emerging gestures, which is always really fun. He loves to play peekaboo. So we've been doing that a lot. He loves to play chase and wave high and bye. He only likes to wave high and bye when he's done with something. And so like he'll take like broccoli from his tray and he'll put it in my hand so gently and nicely. And then he's like, bye-bye. And then that's my cue to put it on the table. But I will say our cue reading is at an all-time high right now. I would say he's a good cue sender, and I hope I'm a good cue reader.
So yeah, on that note, Jolene, like when we think about this, as I mentioned, like kind of when parents are listing GLP as the number one thing, it's kind of putting something ahead of the foundation. And when I think of the Autistic Culture podcast type of dialogues that we have, it's a description of how autistic speech might develop. But what we're thinking of in DIR is, and especially the clinicians that you guys are, I'm not a clinician, but I'm a mother, and I'm doing DIR floor time with my son who, has a lot of emerging and constrictions in his first 6 capacities, and maybe I'm trying to foster some 7 and 8, but we'll see, the functional, emotional, developmental capacities in the DIR model. We are really thinking about where this child is. So where they are might be only scripting song lyrics and no other language. It might be, and I think getting into situational mutism probably is off topic for this podcast, but Jolene, that's kind of a different thing. It's when you're overwhelmed and you can't speak. But if we're talking about emerging language, and only hearing scripts, it's where they are developmentally. And we're focused on development, and the DIR model is about going back to how do we get that emotional regulation, and that's impacted by meeting that person where they're at and having that relationship. And again, Dr. Alan Shore described it so beautifully in that Huberman podcast. Like, it's pure Greenspan stuff. Having that right brain implicit connection and affect, joining each other, feeling safe, and that emotional regulation allows you to then engage with somebody at the second capacity. That allows you then to have a back and forth, whether it's gestural or with scripts or whatever, and then moving forward along the capacities. So describe that, like, how do you sort of tell parents, like, it's nice that your child's a GLP. Well, that sounds condescending, but you know what I mean? Like, that's very important information that your child's a GLP. And this is how I use that. And this is what I'm focused on in facilitating their development, because the relationship is the number one thing. And then we're looking at those individual differences and meeting them where they are developmentally and trying to move them along.
Great question. The easy answer, I think, is that I constantly am referring back to educating about the model itself, about DIR itself. And so when I talk about the D as those developmental capacities, then we have all of the I and then the R, right? So not any one part is more important than the other. And I think that that's really what all of us have been saying today, is that when someone comes in and says, my child's a GLP, that's great. But to me, I just file that in the list of individual differences that make up this particular child. That GLP does not supersede any other individual difference, if that makes sense. So I'm taking those all at, I guess, face value, and just kind of putting them on equal footing and keeping that in mind. So I'm holding still that D while we're supporting, shoring up, strengthening, and celebrating the individual differences that particular child has. So again, the easy answer is that I'm constantly referring back to the foundational components of the model, and that we're meeting that child where they are. I am constantly, and I would guess that the other SLPs here today are doing the same thing. We're constantly assessing where that D is, what individual difference in that moment is maybe causing or contributing to the greatest constrictions that we're observing in that particular interaction, right? Whatever that interaction is in that moment. And then as our clinical hat is on, how are we then kind of nudging to that, proximal development level, right? What is that kind of next push that we're able to access? I'm making it probably sound easier than it is. And I think all of us at our level of skill probably make it look easier when somebody's watching us do it, because we're holding so many things in our mind while we're engaging and interacting with that child. But really having that full understanding of no one individual differences supersedes the other, and that the model itself is looking at that emotional side in addition to the individual differences, right? So, and just because all of us are SLPs here today, we're not ignoring the motor planning, the sensory processing, the dietary restrictions or changes or challenges, the glucose levels in, some of our kids, whatever it might be that's making that child unique. We're holding that the whole time, depending on that particular child. And so constantly going back and reviewing with the family about the whole picture. We are holistic developmental, providers. We're not just looking at one specific tunnel vision area. And for me, I'm at a place in my career and with my practice that when I have families that come in that are really, really strict about, I only want you to start at, stage 1, my child's stage 1 GLP, we need to mitigate to whatever. I just don't feel that I'm a great fit for those particular clients, because again, my process is this whole picture view, this whole lens or whole picture lens of supporting the kids and their families.
And so again, I think that speaks to this whole focus on product and structure and techniques. And, parents want to hear that. And Sabrina gave some good examples in the last podcast, like let's give them mid to blah, blah, blah phrases to use, like, let's go, let's do this, where they can transfer it to other things. But that's sort of secondary to the whole foundational piece of how do we meet this child and how do we look at how they're developing, because some children will develop their speech, their spoken language more quickly than others. Some may not develop spoken language, but it's the communication and the back and forth, the third FEDC3, the back and forth communication, intentionality and two-way communication that we're fostering. Yes, Erin.
I had two quick things. One thing going off of what Jolene said too is that I think we also have to remember a lot of the research also kind of suggests that as a lot of us can be a combination of both GLP analytic, just because a child processes language primarily in Gestalts does not mean that they can't develop more independent language without very distinct intervention. So what I love about DIR too is that as you're building all these other capacities, that language oftentimes will also grow. And so often when people come, like Julie was saying, and I really want this strict, as we facilitate and build this strength in all of these other capacities, that sometimes will happen in its own trajectory as well. And so keeping that in mind too, so for caregivers to understand, like we are supporting this through all of these, social emotional capacities, through all the other individual differences that I'm looking at, can I think also help us take a little bit of a deep breath too, that this is a very natural process of how they're engaging in language. And what I also tell caregivers is when we know that a child is really connecting with affect and intonation, as like most children do, but our GLPs, it's very intense. We have to be very cautious and intentional with the language and the words that we're using, especially in an emotionally charged interaction, because those are the moments where the child is really picking up on that language. And I had a kid that like every time he would get frustrated, he would say no and his name, because that's what he heard over and over again when he would get frustrated. And so being very intentional, more in those moments where you're feeling truly connected with the child, those are the moments to really focus on with the language that you're modeling, because that's a very affectively charged interaction. And being very, like I always say, we have to like hold those experiences very, I always say it, and then the word I'm losing, but just like being very careful and supportive and in tune with that child. But again, looking at their motor planning and their praxis is oftentimes huge with these children. There's a lot of conversations that are happening about that as well, that I think, I'm sure a lot of people have, I don't know what direction you want to go in, but I know, that's really being talked about as well. And I think there is a little bit of misunderstanding that happens sometimes with those connections, but that's a huge piece of what we focus on in regard to understanding their sequencing, and language is a big piece of that. So those, I always like to keep those things in mind too.
So I would like to dive into that, but first I just want to say, as a parent, what Erin said is so important, because it's really hard, because as parents, when we get triggered, when our children's emotions go up and we snap something out, and that's the highly charged emotional moment that they remember. I think of going to model train homes on layout tours with my son, and the model train derails and the guy's like, oh, what did he say now? Of course, now I forget the Gestalt, but he said something like, oh, bother, or something like that. It wasn't oh, bother, but that was a different thing. And so my son repeats that all the time and thought it was hilarious because he could see how much. And, think about kids that hear someone say, oh, swear word, right? And then that's funny because that's what they hear. And so that's an important point, because we have to remember as parents, but then again, that's a hard thing to put on ourselves, because be in control at all times and always know what you're saying, because otherwise your kid will script that. That's a hard thing to put on parents, but it's something to be aware of. But as your profession as a speech language pathologist, you can really foster those kinds of things and really try and get those emotional moments that are so much fun, and laughing together and saying things that will then promote that communication going forward, I think is what you mean. And so, yeah, does anyone want to jump in? Like maybe Brooks, because we did that podcast on gesturing. I know Erin just alluded to that whole, there's this sensory motor affect connection, and I don't pretend to know about it, but do you want to go on that topic before we wrap up today?
Yeah. I wanted to say too, what you were talking about with that, like as a parent, I think we also have to acknowledge that some caregivers come to us in this fear of like, I have to do this. Like I heard about this and I have to do this. And so we sometimes have to meet them and be like, okay, well, what can we, like acknowledging that there's fear. Like when you have a child who has a diagnosis or looks different than this fantasy child that you thought, or whose neurotype is different than your own, I think we have to acknowledge like some of what our families are feeling is fear. Like, am I doing enough? And if we don't do it this exact way, then I'm gonna fail my child. So I think we have to, that's part of, as floor timers, I think we have to remember the parents' individual differences, which makes it even more challenging, right? Like we were talking about, I think all of us probably make it look easy, but it is a lot to hold and remember and to think about. But yeah, moving towards that thought of like that sensory affect motor, I think those are part of the individual differences that we try to remember. And then we try to think about how we're modeling and how we're helping to support each individual and what, like where they are developmentally, where they are with their individual differences, even down to when we're thinking about AAC, maybe for a Gestalt language processor, maybe having some phrases is a great thing, but we also, that's not the only thing we would think about when we're doing what we would call like a feature match, like which language system and device would fit best for this particular child, because maybe we're also thinking about the caregivers' individual differences and where they are developmentally and what we want them to be able to have access to that device and to know how to modify it as needed. And so if it's really what we're wanting is really complex because we think that would support the GLP piece best, that might not end up being the best thing, right? So I think we're always having to keep a lot of things in mind. But if we are always supporting that D, that I, and the R, then I think we're probably supporting everything.
Yeah, and it's so complex. It's so simple yet so complex. Like when I think, I will refer people back to another podcast I did with Jahan years ago, which is what to expect from a developmentally minded speech language pathologist or something like that. And she sort of talks about that process. But yeah, I mean, I sometimes, reflect and I'm like, oh, thank goodness my child used spoken language, because I would be so overwhelmed if I had to learn how to use an AAC device and know everything. Like I get overwhelmed with even the simplest things when his iPad doesn't work and he's like, help, it's not working. And like that panic makes me panic. And then I just want to calm everything down. And yeah, I would be so overwhelmed. So my heart and respect and amazement goes out to parents who get on top of AAC and provide that for their children, because that would be way too overwhelming for me. But maybe other things that are overwhelming for other parents come easier to me. I don't know. Everybody's individual differences, right? So I like that you brought up matching what you think will be beneficial to the family that promotes the child's development. What can the parents do to foster it? Because you can show them everything and then they can't do it. So yeah. Yeah, I know that ICDL, one of our employees is Gretchen Kamke, an occupational therapist, and she also talks about how, the whole thing with praxis is so difficult because some kids will point to one thing when they really wanted to point to another thing. So, that whole idea of cue reading and cue sending is so important. But what if the child is sending cues that they don't mean to send? And how do you guys deal with that in DIR?
That concept of that unreliable communication, right? I'll be honest, for me, that is a difficult, I feel like we could spend a whole other hour or two on just that concept, because this idea of unreliability, when it is still coming from the child, there is still some purpose and meaning, is where I'm coming from. So even if it's inaccurate, there is some connection there. And so for me, that concept of is that motor plan not accurate? So if we are talking about AAC and they're using some particular phrase maybe that we put on there, and they're going to that because the motor plan is such that they are confident in going there, but then maybe it doesn't mean what we think it means, right? Then that detective work that we're all trying to do and sort of resolve, I think gets more complex and complicated. And truly, I think the best thing that I have found in my freedom in DIR is that no child has to fit inside of one little box, right? Every kid can be multiple things in all of those categories. And so that gives me as a clinician such freedom. I'm a mom of a neurodivergent daughter, and to have never put her into a specific box or category to label, we talked about that at the start, to label any one component or characteristic or trait that she exhibited or that my clients show. I just think that gives us such freedom and power to truly do all of the floor time strategies that we love and know so well, to meet the kids where they are, to meet the families where they are, and to go from that. When we talk about that mitigable, phrases and so on, I think we naturally, as developmental therapists, we already were building off of those phrases, right? The things, Jessica, you said at the beginning, ready, set, go, 1, 2, 3, all set, or whatever the phrases were, those rote carrier phrases or repetitive phrases that we would use, we're already changing those naturally in our dialogues. And it doesn't have to be so prescriptive and protocol based the way that we talked about at the start. So I know I just went to 3 different directions there, but yeah.
Yeah, Katie?
I'd love to just build on that. I just feel that in DIR, we never feel like we're in a box, that we have to say a particular thing at a particular time. And I think it's so genuine, and we're present in the moment. And that's what is so wonderful about this model, that we can meet an individual where they are and also think about where we are, like Brooks was talking about, in the moment, our own individual profiles. And that's how we want to promote that thinking in the parents, so that we're able to be as genuine and present. And so whenever there's a model that comes along that may make you feel or may look like a clinician is stuck and that they have to say a particular thing at a particular time, that's hard for me to embrace and I appreciate all of the things that I can learn from all of the other approaches out there, because I think we never stop learning. But I do just always come back to DIR, like Jessica said. And it's so great to be a part of this framework. And I'm so glad that we have been able to learn that from Dr. Greenspan and all of the great people after him, just to be present and be in the moment.
And I think just when you're doing the back and forth and you are in that moment with them, you notice things that can give you clues that like I'm this is sort of after the fact, but delayed processing. When we were talking about Jolene, like if the child is maybe pointing yes when they meant to point no or whatever, in that Dr. Alan Shore interview, he talked about how the nervous system is in the eyes. And I've heard, I can't remember who, say that, I think Stuart Shanker, the eyes get dilated when you're dysregulated. And so maybe even just like noticing cues like that, like, oh, the child said yes, you said yes, but they meant no. And then you notice their eyes dilate or something like that, that can show that they're a bit dysregulated. Or sometimes kids who are looking super excited, and my son's flapping all the time when he's excited, and you think it's happy excitement, but it might be distressed excitement and stuff like that. It's all tough, but I think, Katie, you spoke to that, like being in the moment and being able to have that repair, like, I think you might mean this, but I'm not sure, and sitting in the moment, and then maybe they give you more cues. Erin, you were going to say.
Well, that's it. Like, going off of that rupture and repair, like there's always going to be rupture and repair in any sort of communication. And the relationship is the foundation of that child feeling safe, that you're eventually going to understand them, that we're going to work through this. And so, you know, lingering in that space of like, let's just understand each other and be with each other and have this moment and build relationship. And I think of a little boy, and this is my favorite story, and I won't tell the whole story, but he came to our session with a piece of paper wanting to be the Pixar lamp. And he had apraxia of speech, and it took us 45 minutes to help him become the Pixar lamp, because I'm horrible at crafting, but also because we had so much rupture. And he was a Gestalt language processor, and he would say 5 miles an hour when he got bored or I didn't know something. But because we had the relationship and we used so many cues, and he trusted that, like, if I misread this, I was going to work really, really hard to understand where he came from, because I had spent so much time building that trust with him and helping him feel safe, and through that co-regulation. And so that's, that huge piece of, we're going to misread, we're going to not fully understand this, is all going to happen. But if we build the strength, and that's, kids often pick up on scripts from relationship and connection of characters that they're watching too. So when we start to connect with them more too, that's when you hear them imitating a lot more of what you're saying, because like, she gets me. Miss Erin gets it. That must be what I mean when I say that, because I'm here with her, just like Bluey got it, or this other character, like they get it. That's why the swear words they imitate all the time, because like when mom was really mad, that's exactly what she said. And when I'm mad, that must be the word that I should be using, because of that relationship. But the core of DIR, and that really fuels that strength and the beauty in that interaction.
Any final thoughts as we wrap up this episode, although this topic could go on forever and ever in numerous directions?
I think like my final thoughts would be to just remember that language is so complex, and the complexities don't just stay within like one person, it's across people. Everybody learns language differently. And when we hear words and phrases like typical development or like natural language acquisition, we're thinking about maybe a group of people or a large group of people, but there's always going to be individuals who have their own trajectory. And as DIR speech language pathologists, it's in our profession, it's in like our practice to look at that individual child's development and to not make gross characterizations or these gross generalizations when we have the individual child sitting there in front of us. We can say, oh, this is what typical language can sometimes look like. But it's not something that we can say with 100% certainty, this is what it's going to look like in the future. And so that's what I think is so beautiful about using DIR to guide speech and language development, is because we're looking at everybody's individual differences, and we're taking their social emotional development, we're tailoring our relationship, and what one session with one kid looks like is not going to be the same even the next session or kid to kid. And so that's what I think is so beautiful about this methodology and this approach to speech language pathology, is because it's so individualized and it takes into account all of the different factors that make us unique individuals.
Well said.
And, I think about ICDL's board president, Emil House, who said he really didn't speak until he was 15. I've heard 14 to 16. I can't remember what the exact age was, but I mean, that's a pretty significantly older age than we would hear. And, he has a PhD now. Like if you really sit down and talk to him, a lot of times if you hear him speak, it might sound like a scripted speech, but, I've met with him on, when he's not giving a speech, and just the way his mind thinks and everything, like he really is a true academic, like with a PhD, and just incredible how development can look so different. And Jolene, I remember the story that you told me, I think it's in our podcast that we did, where you said, I stopped predicting which kids will speak and which kids won't because you were surprised, you thought that kid
They
will never
proved me
speak. And then
wrong.
you got a letter from the mother when the kid was in college or whatever. So yeah, it's hard for parents when they see all the other kids developing and they don't know what's going to happen with their child. But every child has their own process and blooms in their time into what their developmental potential is. And that's what I think what DIR is focused on. And Gestalt language processors are just a piece of that, a small piece of that. But let's look at the bigger developmental picture. So I thank you so much for being a part of this dialogue. And listeners, if you check out the show notes at affectautism.com, I will put links to past podcasts I've done with 4 of the panelists and some of the other stuff we've referred to, including my podcast with Dr. Barry Prezant, which I never would have been able to get today, but I got him before he became super, super famous with the Uniquely Human podcast. Yeah, thank you so much, everybody.
You've been listening to DIR Dialogues from Affect Autism. If you have an idea for a DIR dialogue topic, please shoot me an email. Thanks for listening. This episode of DIR Dialogues is made possible with the generous financial support of Affect Autism's members and of the International Council on Development and Learning, ICDL.com. Please share this episode on social media, sign up for our newsletter, and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, or Instagram. Find out more at affectautism.com.